What if I told you the Titanic never actually sank? So the owner of the boat, JP Morgan, actually had two boats, the Titanic and the Olympic. The Olympic was older and more run down and was also in an accident. So the theory states that JP Morgan sank the boat on purpose because he knew he would get a lot of money from the insurance policy. But why sink the newly built Titanic when you could just scratch off the paint, swap the names, and sink the Olympic instead? But it gets even worse when you realize that JP Morgan's business competitors were also on the boat and not one of them made it out. And guess who wasn't on the boat? JP Morgan. He canceled just minutes before it left. And there was a man named James Fenton who worked on building the boat and survived the sinking. And on his deathbed, his last words were, "The Titanic never sank. It was the Olympic." And he said he was told that if he ever said anything, something bad would happen to him.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Bearable Bull here. And man, do I have this aggressively average content for you today, as this is my first episode of the Aggressively Average podcast. How the elites sunk the Titanic to create the Federal Reserve System and inevitably bring on the Ripple XRP financial system. This is a passion project, something I've been working extremely hard on, and something I'm going to continue to deliver every single week, as the reason for starting this podcast is to shed light about the truth going on in the world. I've done my absolute best to highlight the world agenda for the future financial system, but I also think I'd be doing a disservice if I didn't highlight everything else at play on the world stage. There are many different agendas that lead to the overall takeover of the planet and the world we're heading into. But the financial agenda specifically is something I've been touching for a really long time. I believe it's my purpose in this world to be one of God's messengers, and this podcast is my opportunity to give this message without being neutered or compromised, with the potential of being canceled. Typically, all episodes will always be made available on Rumble and Spotify. But for today, we're not getting into the deep, dark secrets of the world. We're just getting into the history of the Federal Reserve. Not enough people know this specific story. But lucky for all of you, it's not bad enough that YouTube will take me down. I'm really excited to introduce to every single one of you how we got here and where the root of many of the world's problems come from. And I hope all of you join me on this journey, as I've always appreciated all of your support. Now guys, without further ado, let's get into it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it goes without saying that before I can get into this first podcast episode, I have to give credit where credit is due. G. Edward Griffin blew the lid off of this with his famous book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, a second look at the Federal Reserve. And it exposed a lot of the secrets about the initial meeting that took place on Jekyll Island, right outside the state of Georgia, that ensures we all know what the hell happened. Every single one of you need to understand that everything I'm going to discuss in this video is factual, and the only things that are not confirmed will be the intention of people. I cannot confirm anyone's intentions, but I can simply state facts, and you can put the pieces together and come up to your own conclusions. First and foremost, we need to understand that the beginning of the Federal Reserve System took place at the meeting at Jekyll Island from November 20th, 1910 to November 30th. It was a secret gathering on a secluded island called Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia in 1910. And I want every single one of you to pay extremely close attention to the sequence of the years when things go into place, and how there are no coincidences on the world stage. 6 men: Nelson Aldrich, Piot Andrew, Henry Davidson, Arthur Shelton, Frank Vanderlip, Paul Wahlberg, met at the Jekyll Island Club to write a plan to reform the nation's banking system. In addition, Benjamin Strong, Paul Warburg, J.P. Morgan need to be mentioned as key architects to this. The catalyst for this meeting at Jekyll Island was the Panic of 1907. This was a global financial crisis that was the inspiration and the reason that the Federal Reserve Act was able to get passed. And all of you can do your own deep dives into the Panic of 1907. But for right now, what I want to do is give you the words of G. Edward Griffin himself, discussing who exactly these men were that met that fateful day at Jekyll Island. Please take a listen and learn about the architects of this system.
Over the concentration of financial power that was in the hands of a small group of very powerful and large banks in New York on Wall Street. This is what they called the money trust. That was the name. And it was a very popular expression in the newspapers. And quite a few politicians were elected to office on their campaign promise to break the grip of the money trust. President Wilson was one of those politicians, by the way. So that was the purpose of the National Monetary Commission, which was to propose legislation, which eventually became the Federal Reserve Act, to break the grip of the money trust over the financial markets of America. Aldrich was a business associate of J.P. Morgan. He was the father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller, Jr., which means, of course, that eventually he became the grandfather of Nelson Rockefeller, our former vice president. You remember his full name was Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, so he derived his middle name from his famous grandfather. The second person at the meeting was Abraham Piot Andrew, who was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. He later became a congressman, but he was very prominent in banking circles. Frank Vanderlip was there. He was the president of the National City Bank of New York, which was the largest and the most powerful of all the banks in the country, representing the financial interests of William Rockefeller and the international investment firm of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Henry Davidson was there. He was the senior partner of the J.P. Morgan Company. Charles Norton was present. He was the president of the First National Bank of New York, which was another one of the giants. Also, there was Benjamin Strong, who was the head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company. And incidentally, 3 years later, when the Federal Reserve System was finally created, he became the first head of the system. And finally, there was Paul Warburg, who was probably the most important of all the men there because of his knowledge of banking as it was practiced in Europe. Paul Warburg was born in Germany. He eventually became a naturalized American citizen. He was a partner in Kuhn, Loeb and Company. He was a representative of the Rothschild banking dynasty in England and France. And through all the years of his banking in America, he remained in very close contact with his brother, Max Warburg, who was the head of the Warburg Banking Consortium in Germany and the Netherlands. Paul Warburg was one of the wealthiest men in the world. And those of you who are Little Orphan Annie fans, you'll remember Daddy Warbucks. Well, Paul Warburg was the real Daddy Warbucks, after whom that character was named. And everyone at the time knew it. I have his photograph in the book. If you'd like to compare his picture to the drawing rendition of Daddy Warbucks, you'll see the similarity between Warbucks and Warburg. And also, while we're on the subject of cartoon characters, anyone who's played Monopoly will remember the drawing of the capitalist with the handlebar mustache and the cigar. That's J.P. Morgan. Those are the 7 men who were on Jekyll Island. And as incredible as it may seem, they represented approximately 1/4 of the wealth of the entire world. And these are the men that sat around a table on Jekyll Island and created the Federal Reserve System. What's going on here? Should arouse our curiosity a little bit. It didn't just happen. What's the big deal here? What's wrong with a group of bankers getting together in private and talking about banking or banking legislation? And the answer to that question is provided by Vanderlip himself in the same article. He said, If it were to be exposed publicly that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatever of passage by Congress. Why not? Because the purpose of the bill was to break the grip of the money trust. And ladies and gentlemen, it was written by the money trust. It's as simple as that. Had that fact been known from the very beginning, the public would never have accepted it as a means of breaking the grip over the money trust. And we would never have had a Federal Reserve System because the scam would have been exposed from the beginning. This was like having the fox build a hen house and install the security system.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, isn't that a beautiful analogy? Keep that in your minds as we proceed. Now that you know a little bit about the people who were there at Jekyll Island, let's fast forward to one of history's most tragic events. On 1912, the Titanic sunk, and here is a list of 10 famous people who died on the Titanic. Here, first off, we have John Astor. He was a German-American millionaire who made his fortune in real estate and was the great-grandson of John Jacob Astor, who founded the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. Benjamin Guggenheim, a famous rich passenger, heir to the family's mining business. He initially thought the accident was a minor one, but then the story goes that he changed into his formal evening wear to face death. He wasn't originally supposed to be on the ship, but then, due to technical errors on the other ship he was supposed to be on, he got on the Titanic. Isidor Straus, a German-born co-owner of the Macy's department store in New York, and there were plenty more. But the reason I bring up these three specifically is because these individuals in particular were opposed to the Jekyll Island meeting, were opposed to the Federal Reserve Act and the implementation of the central banking system. These are indisputable facts. And another indisputable fact is J.P. Morgan himself was supposed to be on the Titanic, but the day before, he chose not to go. J.P. Morgan also owned a company who owned the Titanic. These are all also indisputable facts, and I'll let you all make of that what you will. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what we're going to do here is fast forward in time just a bit. Now that you have a little bit of context with the people that went to Jekyll Island, the sinking of the Titanic, who the people who sunk on the Titanic were, and G. Edward Griffin's analysis of the situation, I'm going to take you to the date when the Senate passes the Federal Reserve Act. The date was December 23rd, 1913, a couple days before Christmas. It was a last-minute bill that was attempted to get pushed through. And this specific act is one of those moments in American history that was so important that we need to look back at what happened the days where it was getting passed. Here, I have a powerful breakdown of what occurred on those days. And I want you all to think and ask yourselves if there's something fishy about how exactly things came together.
And so even the New York Times said, never has legislation of such importance been passed under such circumstances. In other words, the whole Federal Reserve Act was passed through fraud. It was passed more or less while Congress was in Christmas vacation. And so Wilson signed the act into law on December 23rd, practically Christmas Eve, and it became public law. So now that they have a central bank with the power to print all the money they wanted, a privately owned bank, and the Federal Reserve Act itself is an amazing act. It's an act of total monopoly because every word in it, first of all the money that the bankers can print becomes an obligation of the U.S. government, which means the U.S. taxpayer. Second, the stockholders of this private bank included in the legislation that no Federal Reserve Bank stock could ever be bought or sold on any exchange in the world. So in other words, the initial purchasers would own it in perpetuity, which is what happened because the Rothschilds, Warburgs, and Schiffs all bought the original stock in 1914 and have owned it ever since. And they've put it into foundations so it can never be touched. And these foundations are the real government of the United States, Rockefeller Foundation. Nearly all of your major legislation in the United States is prepared by these foundations. And they submit it to Congress, and of course they have enormous staffs and billions of dollars. So they bring the legislation before Congress. And it's impeccable, it's researched and it's phrased and everything is done just right. And so of course the Congress accepts it. And they look around and they say, is anybody objected to any of this? And of course there's total silence, nobody objects. So it becomes law. That's why you have laws constantly passed by Congress, which are actively opposed by 85% of the American people. Almost everything that's done in Washington is opposed by 85% of the American people. So you have government by 15%, government by elites. And they're not even Americans, these are international elitists. They have no allegiance whatsoever to the United States. Just like your Canadian legislatures have no allegiance to you, they have no allegiance to Canada, they're part of the international elite. But of course they don't say this publicly, and the press hails them all as great patriots and dedicated people, selfless individuals. They love that word selfless. Imagine, all your legislators are selfless. They never have a selfish bone in their body because they're working for you. They want to give you things. And of course, the only purpose they have is to rob you. Not only you, but all 6 billion people in the world, because it's a government of robbery. So you have what you call the new economy in the United States, and probably Canada too. And the new economy is simply people working and creating and producing in spite of everything the robbers can do to them. Everything that's accomplished in this country is accomplished in spite of the foundations, in spite of the bankers. People have to work harder to pay the interest, but they do that. They rise to the challenge. At some point, the people will have to make themselves recognized. And they're doing this through the internet. The big question mark is the internet. And that's why Washington has been making frantic efforts to control the internet.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, there is so much to dissect from that clip. First and foremost, I want to touch on this. Since 1913, we've had what is called a new economy in the United States, where Americans have been forced to fight an uphill battle. We're fighting an uphill battle against the Federal Reserve Act implemented in 1913 that causes inflation, devalues our purchasing power and our saving power. But not only that, with no coincidences in sight, 1913 was also the exact same year the Federal Income Tax Act and the 16th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution was implemented. There are no coincidences. The federal income tax was put into the American financial system along with the Federal Reserve in the exact same year because the income tax is used to pay off the interest on the debt that we print from the Federal Reserve consistently. I know that they say it's for roads. I know that they say it's for programs. I know that it's for the military. All of these things are true at the exact same time, but the original idea in mind was a 1-2 punch of taxing the American citizens and destroying their independent wealth with inflation. That is the goal of this system. The secret death by 1,000 cuts no one was paying attention to because this bill was passed right before Christmas. And the people that could have stopped it died in the sinking of the Titanic. Now, this is where people are going to say, hey, bull, hey. What are you trying to make of this? Absolutely nothing other than I'm tired of people thinking a sequence of events are coincidence. And this is where I'm going to take you on a little bit of a history lesson when it comes to the Federal Reserve, and specifically with central banks. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to lie to all of you. This next part of this video is referencing a book called The Suppressed History of American Banking, how big banks fought Jackson, killed Lincoln, and caused the Civil War. What's so funny is that this is not the first Federal Reserve central bank that has been implemented in the United States. There have been a total of 3 central banks. And you know what's crazy is that with the birth of each bank and the inevitable abolishing have come assassination attempts. For example, in 1833, Andrew Jackson got rid of the second central bank of the United States. 2 years later, there was an attempt on his life. What's also interesting is how war circulates around the establishment of these central banks. The author of the book revealed how the War of 1812 began after Congress failed to renew a 20-year charter for the central bank. After the War of 1812, the ensuing debt forced Congress to grant the central banking scheme another 20-year charter, and the author explains how this spurred Andrew Jackson, who was fed up with the central banking system and the Rothschilds' control of Congress and the government, to enter politics, become president, and inevitably get rid of the second central bank. He became the only president to ever pay off the national debt. And when the central banking system finally came for its renewal in 1836, he successfully rallied Congress to vote against it. The author explains how after failing to regain their power politically, the Rothschild banking system plunged the country into the American Civil War. Oh, how interesting is that? Now that, my friends, is speculation, but it is an interesting read for those who are interested. He then shows how Lincoln created a system to allow the United States to flourish on its own money without the need for a central bank, and how this led to his assassination by a supposed Rothschild agent. With Lincoln out of the picture, the Rothschilds were able to wipe out his prosperous monetary system, which plunged the United States into high unemployment and a recession that laid the foundation for the inevitable formation of the Federal Reserve Bank. Isn't it so interesting how around the birth and death of the central banking system, throughout all of the 1800s and even into the 1900s, there was wars and attempts on people's lives? Well, it doesn't just stop there. You're all about to learn why I get so frustrated at people thinking there's coincidences when it comes to the Federal Reserve. Before I get into it, here's a brief clip of what I believe is one of the most important factors that the Fed uses in order to make money and establish power.
A central bank is a group of bankers which have total control of a nation's economy. And they print their own money, print as much as they want to, and it eventually becomes worthless. And I defined in my work that a central bank's principal role is for war finance, because war finance is the most profitable enterprise you can get into. And so if you're a banker, you're looking for the best investment you can make, which is a war.
There are few historians who would challenge the fact that the funding of World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War was accomplished by the Mandrake mechanism through the Federal Reserve System. An overview of all wars since the establishment of the Bank of England in 1694 suggests that most of them would have been greatly reduced in severity, or perhaps not even fought at all, without fiat money. It is the ability of governments to acquire money without direct taxation that makes modern warfare possible, and a central bank has become the preferred method of accomplishing that. We theorize a strategy dubbed the Rothschild formula, in which the world's money cabal deliberately encourages war as a means of stimulating the profitable production of armaments and keeping nations perpetually in debt. This is not profit-seeking, it is genocide. It is not a trivial matter, therefore, to inquire into the possibility that our elected and non-elected leaders are, in fact, implementing the Rothschild formula today.
You know what, Bull? You had me for a second in this video, but you lost me today. Right here is typically the point I lose a lot of people, especially friends, family, and loved ones, when I discuss the Federal Reserve. And yet, ironically enough, 1914 was the year World War I began. 1 year after the implementation of the Federal Reserve. Isn't that so interesting? The hypothesis that a central bank's principal role is for war finance is something I heavily questioned. I couldn't believe it. But then I thought about it, looked at timelines, and thought to myself, it makes sense. You see, there were central banks implemented around the world, specifically in Europe, before the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. But I believe implementing the Federal Reserve in the United States was the massive chess piece that changed the game forever. Europe was a powerhouse, especially in the 20th century. Something I'll add is that them gaining control of America's financial system through the Fed and externally funding the war in Europe in World War I and then again in World War II, that's a money laundering game that, well, even the finest of scammers couldn't have predicted. Something tells me that when I give you this next piece of information, you guys will all put it together. The Federal Reserve gets implemented in 1913, then World War I breaks out in 1914. Then, from 1939 to 1945, World War II was taking place. And like clockwork, at the exact same time, the creation of the Bretton Woods system took place July 1944. And what you will need to understand is that World War II propelled the world economy out of the Great Depression. That's something you all need to note. At the same time, at the Bretton Woods Agreement, Bretton Woods envisioned an international monetary system. This is what you need to understand. John Maynard Keynes is where these international bodies like the IMF and World Bank get their inspiration from. He called for the creation of a large institution with the resources and authority to step in when imbalances occur. Cough, cough, IMF. This was consistent in his belief that public institutions should be able to intervene in times of crisis. This goes all the way back to the crisis of 1907. That was the initial catalyst for enabling the Federal Reserve Act. The Keynes plan envisioned a global central bank called the Clearing Union, and this bank would issue a new international currency, the Bancor, which would be used to settle international imbalances. Each country would receive a limited line of credit that would prevent it from running a balance of payments deficit, but each country would also be discouraged from running surpluses by having to remit excess Bancor to the Clearing Union. Then, fast forward, as World War II ended in 1945, we also saw that the IMF came into formal existence December 1945. 29 member countries signed its Articles of Agreement, and then the countries agreed to keep their currencies fixed but adjustable within a 1% band to the dollar, and the dollar was fixed to the price of gold at $35 an ounce. Also remember, a decade prior, the confiscation of gold from Americans, and then the repricing of gold that occurred. Oh, ladies and gentlemen, this is something you need to be aware of. When big financial moves happen, there's always a crisis that comes with it. In enters Bretton Woods 2. Remember this headline when they stated the second Bretton Woods agreement ended December 9th, 2022. Oh, Saudi accepting one for oil. People forgot, but I'm making sure you remember. We are in the next, and what I believe will be the final stage of the Federal Reserve banking system. The dismantling of the old fiat currency system into the digital currency system. But we need a crisis. Cough, cough. Health crisis. Cough, cough. Lockdowns. And cough, cough. Russia, Ukraine. You see, they've already formulated the narrative, the reason why we need to implement the next generation of this system. But 99% of the population are asleep at the wheel, not paying attention. The BRICS nations have been adding new members to get away from the US dollar, as the past iteration of the global reserve currency is about to be abolished. The new one is waiting in the wings. You know, there's something I hate when it comes to the topics that I discuss, and it's these little semantic games communities like to play. See, in my personal opinion, I believe XRP will be the world's reserve currency. More specifically, the world's neutral bridge asset to bridge all the world's currencies. A lot of people don't like when I say that. I know what I mean when I speak what I say. And I know why I say the things that come out of my mouth. I do my absolute best to be as accurate as possible with the information I have, with the knowledge I've accumulated from researching history. And if there's one thing I can guarantee to all of you, it's that I'll always bring my best aggressively average effort to the table to make sure that as much truth enters your minds as possible. You don't have to believe anything I say, but all I ask is that you think about it. I think the past and understanding the past helps us predict and anticipate the future. And as we look back in history today at how the Fed potentially came into place and what that means for the future, the next episode of this podcast is going to chime in on what the future holds, why certain agendas are being pushed in the mainstream right now. And we're really going to break the internet with this one. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Bearable Bull here. Thanks for tuning in. As always, I appreciate every single one of you. And I'll be back next week with episode 2.
Free humankind. It's in blue. Tesla's thoughts. Free humankind from the burdens of extracting, pumping, transporting, and burning fossil fuels, as he saw as sinful waste. But J.P. Morgan saw it as gold on the streets. That's the kind of world we had access to, and this is where the fight began for it. In the early 1900s. They're yapping today about stop the 1.5 C rise, you got to limit, you got to eat bugs. Well, wait a second, you stole 100 plus years from us. We could have been back there already, and now we don't even get this tech. They want to run us to the garbage solar panels and a bunch of waste and e-waste and rare earth minerals and just junk that's going to pollute the planet, instead of going for what we really need is magnetic motors. It's actually, there was a term for it, fuel-less generators. And welcome back for the second segment here, Many Ice Age Conversations. I'm your host, David Dubine, every other Friday from 2 to 3 p.m. right here on TV, uncensored. Now, before the break, I was talking about the creature from Jekyll Island, the secret meetings on Jekyll Island for the formation of the Federal Reserve, and those opposed to it happened to be on the Titanic when it sank in 1912. After the ratification and formation of the Federal Reserve, World War I starts just a year later. Unlimited money printing at that point. That was the first actual inflation to be seen, was the conflict. So from 1913 to 1918, the dollars at that time saw their first 5% reduction in value through the inflation of printing for the war effort. Again, America had to get lured in with Lusitania in World War I. Can't keep their fingers off the buttons on these things, can they? So this book right here, The Creature from Jekyll Island, G. Edward Griffin. Excellent. You must read it. Super thick book. Now, he's been out speaking recently, and if you go to Stansberry Research with Daniela Cambone, he did an excellent interview there. Since he understood the formation of the Federal Reserve, he's quite attuned into what's happening with the new central bank digital currencies and the very easy parallels to see between this. His words, not mine. The same people that interfere with the rollouts of the central bank digital currency will be eliminated. It's way easier to do today. Things happen, strange accidents, and anybody that's opposed to CBDC rollouts in countries or wanting to leapfrog disruptive technologies ahead of what they're supposed to roll out with the narratives of solar panels and windmills, if they want to jump ahead of that, well, that's not good either. So it seems if you have a lot of money and you're in the industry, you're kind of locked in. You can't go into the future, because a lot of these people who have money are futurists that see it, and they just have to kind of, bite their tongue and stay back in the old, like I say, square cave world that we're living in. But what's so interesting, this is, when you talk about the Astors and the Strauss and the Guggenheims and these types of moneyed families, Morgans, et cetera, during that time, this is Fifth Avenue here, the row, the jaded mansions. Now, New York City with this many mansions in it, interesting. And then the wireless power connectors, what you would consider gates on the tops of the homes, that's all disappeared now. I mean, some of these structures are still there. But, the further you step back in time, it gets a little murky too. I think Tesla, had a bunch of his own inventions, but I think that he was also pulling something that was even further back in the past that's just been refound. Because you have to consider this. Just a quick FYI, if you didn't know, the Romans were using compressed air energy technologies, compressed air, where they knew the force of the air could actually spin something. They were using that back in the Roman era. And then there was a complete blackout until about 1750, and then we found compressed air technologies again in France. And we started using that. Pneumatics, think anything, pneumatic drills, pneumatic tools. Anything pneumatic was compressed air. Now, why is it that it was around in the Roman era until, let's say, I'll even give it 500 AD, and then it disappeared completely until 750 AD? Like, why is that gap there? Did nobody jump ahead in technologies, or were we reset naturally in cyclical cataclysms that took a while for humanity to reemerge, is the question. Like, where did all these mansions come from? Some asked. But speaking about banking, this is another thing here. This is the first bank in the United States ever. Left side is the lithograph, and you notice those really convenient, well-built wooden buildings right next door to it, sharing a wall. Gilded Age, I thought they would be all like this. Shouldn't every building be the same if they had the same technologies to build everything? And then we came to take a look at it close up today with better photography, and look at that Gothic, or I should say Roman Greek architecture. And that was supposedly the first bank built right next to all the pig slop and the mud streets and the brick buildings right next to it, and the things are made out of wood. Same neighborhood, cheap neighbors, bro. What are you thinking? So anyway, that's the story. That's the story we're given. So again, I want to jump back into some strangeness here. Now, Nikola Tesla, if you don't know, is the grandfather and the leading figure of wireless technologies, magnetic motors, and almost every electrical device that is in your home or you've ever seen or touched it has Nikola Tesla technologies and fingerprints all over it. You know, you might think about Edison with the light bulb, but he was put in place to bring out more infrastructure in the current system during the current wars, alternating current, direct current. The more infrastructure you could put out, the more money was needed for mining, and the more raw materials were needed for that infrastructure build out for that new system for electrification. See, Tesla wasn't playing the game either. He's like, we don't need that. Nor was Westinghouse. Start to hear these names in history, and when you glue them together, it's like a little interesting. So Nikola Tesla to the left, Tesla coils, experimentation with using the Paleozoic electrical influences of our crust, along with the ether and the microvolt charge above the crust, and you could recycle that charge, direct it in a certain direction. If you had rods in the earth every so often, that would connect underground and you could recircle it in the air. That's what wireless power was all about. And this is back in the early 1900s, late 1800s. So why haven't we experimented with that? And we're back at solar panels digging through the ground again. So John Jacob Astor Hotel. Nikola Tesla turns up there after he got funded from JP Morgan and says, hey, Mr. Astor, I need a place to stay. And he takes him under his wing, starts to learn about all these technologies. He's like, I wonder if we could power our hotel with this. Wink, wink. And they did for a while. So anyway, Astor's onto this, funds Tesla to continue with his research over at Wycliffe Tower, because JP Morgan pulled the funding. And here's why. It might become a threat to other industrial concerns that he was already committed to at the time. And this is JP Morgan. So the mining, the extraction of and production of chemicals, extraction of oils, leading into chemical production, copper cabling, like I say, the mining interest, JP Morgan was everywhere. So you think about a world that we would not have ever had one copper cable above our heads ever, and we could have drawn power and created it on demand in our homes in a little small unit half the size of my desk. If we would have started from that point instead of where we are today, I'm sure we would have touched into electrogravitics and weightless travel at some point closely right thereafter, which they were already into. Marconi was as well. Marconi, the radio, the first S. So JP Morgan said, Marconi, he already broadcast the first S. Your Wycliffe Tower, I thought it was going to be a radio broadcast system. And Tesla says, it never was intended to that. It was intended for a free power distribution system so nobody would ever have to pay for power. And Morgan was like, whoa, we can't have anything for free, hence becoming a threat to the other industrial concerns. Because, I mean, if you're in the very beginning of wiring out America and say circa 1913 or 1914, how much money do you see in front of you? Timber interest. So Tesla's plan to provide wireless power, and the funding was cut off. Okay, we understand that. No heartfelt requests, absolutely zero money. And then Astor says, yes, I'll give you money. I'll buy 500 shares of your company and continue to fund you while you do this research. Oh, by the way, I got to take a trip on this boat called the Titanic. Hold on. Not coming back. So the best way to describe it is, you know, in the air, there's a constant charge around us. And if you look into electroculture, where you wrap your plants with copper cables or copper wiring, it pulls from that millivolt charge out of the ether and then electrifies your plants and gives them extra, literally, growth energy from the ether. Well, if you look there in the very first paragraph, the fluid electrical charges running beneath the Earth's surface is otherwise termed as Paleozoic currents. It's currents that run through rock and water. So you know the pyramids of Egypt, there's water under those. There's a system of rivers under the pyramids. Now also, the granite that's used in there has a high silica concentrate, but if you know about chips, it's refined silica. So then you start to put these together and go, all right, well, some rocks, as in just granite, can transmit electricity. How about vast mining areas around the Great Lakes of iron ore in the rock? That can transmit electricity. How about huge bauxite reserves, aluminum? That can. How about the silver reserve? That can too. Gold reserves, that can do it too. So everywhere you look around the planet, there's many a mineral that can carry a current. And then combined with water, you have yourself an electrical circuit system. And that's what he was tapping into, literally. No pun intended. It really was. Putting different rods in the earth on a directional flow where they knew the current was, and taking that underground in a looping system. And that's what Wycliffe Tower for, was the recirculation point to push it back down into the earth. Because Wycliffe Tower was directly over an aquifer that they dug down into to get that initial seeding point to send out the current and then reloop it back. Free humankind. It's in blue. Tesla's thoughts. Free humankind from the burdens of extracting, pumping, transporting, and burning fossil fuels, as he saw as sinful waste. But J.P. Morgan saw it as gold on the streets. That's the kind of world we had access to, and this is where the fight began for it. In the early 1900s. They're yapping today about stop the 1.5 sea rise, you got to limit, you got to eat bugs. Well, wait a second, you stole 100 plus years from us. We could have been back there already, and now we don't even get this tech. They want to run us to the garbage solar panels and a bunch of waste and e-waste and rare earth minerals and just junk that's going to pollute the planet, instead of going for what we really need is magnetic motors. It's actually, there was a term for it, fuel-less generators. And as soon as J.P. Morgan heard fuel-less generators and all of his friends out in the investment community, they're like, you need to crush that dude like an insect. Remove all funding. That dude doesn't take another single step forward with technology or advances or invention because he wants to give away free power and he has the full capability to do it. We can't let him get any prototype models up and running. But then he teamed up with Westinghouse, and oh, what did they do? So here's Wycliffe Tower, and if you look at the possibilities of what it was very similar to something like this, tapping into the ether. And when you see different color spectrum, that's just different voltage charges that's coming through the atmosphere. Why do you think lightning's different colors sometimes? Sometimes it's red, sometimes it's yellow, sometimes it's white, sometimes it's blue, sometimes it's purple. That's all because as it's cracking through with a different voltage through the substrate in the air, it's getting glowing plasma and it resonates at different frequencies depending on the voltage input into it. No different. 1917, federal government demolished that. Oh, wait, I thought it was a private residence. Now, how did they go? Oh, they thought it was German spies using it. Can you believe that? That was really the excuse given. The patent for it right here, Tesla magnifying apparatus for transmitting electrical energy. That's patent 1,119,732 in the U.S. Patent Office. Now, there's a huge amount of patents out there right now. So if you want to go through and look at the system for electrical distribution wirelessly, that was patented in when? Let me see. Can I read that? Do I need my reading glasses? 1888. 1888. We're talking way back. And they're trying to feed us solar panels and windmills when we had wireless technologies in 1888. By the way, the first cars were not combustion motors. The first cars were electric vehicles in 1880s also. So again, whether it would be compressed air technologies removed from human view from the Roman era to 1750, and then it popped back up again. Battery technologies were removed from human view in the 1880s and then suddenly popped back up again, what, 20 years ago? Like there's these substantial amounts of technology removed from the human domain and put back in at certain times. Speaking of the Wycliffe Tower, this is Texas in 2019. They've been experimenting. This is a military facility. They're using the same exact technologies again. Again, it was removed because it was going to cause too much disruption in the economy. And now we start to see it pop back up again for usage in military, industrial uses there. They call it the War of the Currents. The War of the Currents. See, there was an alternating system, alternating current or a direct current. And Edison and Tesla were battling for it, inventing different lighting systems for it, the twist-in light bulb, the screw-in light bulb. And you just go back and you say, really, the beginning of the electrical current wars was beginning in the 1880s. Now, there was no clear victor of which system was going to be the one that would be rolled out across the planet. Well, we see now that DC is rolled out over in Europe and AC systems here in the United States and North America. So the beginning of that, Nikola Tesla invents an entirely new electrical system for plug-in and then powers the World's Fair. Then he jumps into, years later, into this wireless technologies, and he's holding these light bulbs in his hand, and they're just powered from the ether. That's scary for a lot of magnates that were counting on mining billions to come in. And you know, this is the World's Fair here in 1893, and now this is in Chicago, if you can believe it. And then apparently after the World's Fair, they needed to destroy all these buildings because they just weren't good enough to leave there as like offices or museums or anything. So what you're seeing here is actual representation, really what was built out for the World's Fair in 1893. And here, Nikola Tesla, one of my favorite people in history. You know, this wireless technology is still here for us, but you as an inventor would need to go off and develop your own because there's no commercial place that you can buy these technologies. The patents are out there. You're just going to have to build your own and be super careful about it. Be careful. You can't commercialize it. You can never even talk about it. You don't do it in presentations. Don't talk about it. Don't mention it. Don't show your coupling systems. Just use it. That's still where we sit today. So when you have a billionaire out in Pakistan says, hey, let's just dust off some of these patents and roll them through the hills of Pakistan, what do you think the world magnates of today do you think are going to do? If they had that much power back in the 1880s, 1900s, 1913, form the Federal Reserve, start world wars, how far do you think it's come in the last 120 years of power grab and consolidation and allegiance to the dark powers? Nikola Tesla, these patents here, 1889, patent number 405,858, electric magnetic motor, meaning using the Earth's magnetic field. And then we have patent number 382,279, patent in 1888, a different type of magnetic motor. All right, so how does this work here? Shahzada Dawood spoke at the World Economic Forum, and the main involvement was for improving livelihoods of women, girls, and was how much opposed to the central bank digital currency rollout is still an unknown. You know, I've been digging down through a lot of articles. I'm trying to call some reporters over in Pakistan and ask. It's an unknown how much pushback there really was against the CBDC from their end of their consortium of companies vocally against it. Parendev magnetic motors, what is being rolled out or was planned to be rolled out in Pakistan, right here on your screen. I have the patents for you below, which I'll get to in just a second. So they're called Parendev magnetic motors, and what you need is neodymium magnets. The schematics is basically two wheels that roll inside of each other. So think of it when you were a kid in school and you had the two magnets on the desk and you pushed one, and if it was of the same polarity, it would push itself apart. You could never get them to connect, and if you try to squeeze them, they always bounced apart. Remember those days back when it was fun when we were kids? Just scale it up to neodymium magnets and then get that magnetic coupling to push continuously in a circle. Now they're all oriented exactly the same polarity, because if they were opposite, they would snap together and lock together. You want it the opposite, so they're going to continually push away from each other at all the times. Now the varying degrees of tilt on the magnets is fascinating too, because sacred numerology puts 36 as a number that we see throughout history. Now magnets orient them at 36 degrees. Again, there's a lot of encoding of different knowledge throughout history, you know, and the religions as well. So here's the diagrams if you would like to build one of these. You're going to need some sort of substrate. You can use aluminum, you can use cast plastics, you're going to need a CNC lathe, and you're going to have to go at this. You're going to need some sort of metallic housing for it so it doesn't spin. This thing rolls. It's kind of noisy too. You need a housing box for it. Just saying. But when it starts to spin, you're going to be going in well excess of 12 to 1700 RPMs. If this thing flies apart at any point in your journey of discovery of how to build one of these things, you would definitely want to stand behind something or put some sort of shielding up when you first run with it to make sure that your whatever poured substrate is going to be hard enough to take that cavitation. You can use aluminum housing too, which is much safer and it's non-magnetic. Now you notice the diagram on the left is very simple, and you just one inside circle has all the magnets. You could choose north or south, doesn't matter, but they need to all be oriented so the magnetic polarity is facing each other. So it does continue to push away each time it makes and breaks that contact on the block wall. And as we're wrapping up here, here's the parent-dev magnetic motor patents. There's several of them, so you can start here. You can go to the U.S. Patent Office, and once you start typing these numbers in and looking for different patents across Europe and the United States, you will come into what you seek. But I just can't believe that this world that we're in right now, we have the exact same overlays of those destroyed or drowned in water, lost at sea, that wanted to make a betterment for the world. You see the world where we are now. I mean, how much change can we make? It's going to be at your very local level first. But I would warn you from experience. If you build these motors, you're going to have eyes. You're going to need to be extremely cautious. You're not going to go blasting this out to your neighborhood and telling everybody that you have it. You can use it for your home use, and that's where it needs to stay for emergencies. If you try to commercialize it, you and your family will have a very difficult time. You'll end up like those people down there in the Ocean Gate submarine, which is a sad fact. Hope their families wish them the best as these days progress. But anyway, knowledge is your armor. Bye for now.